we
so.
really like him.
No, I think John enjoys it as much as Dale.
Oh, I think
John
so.
does it too.
I think it's a mutual thing, you know. And Dale's got to be used to it by now.
Yeah.
Because I've noticed that.
Yeah. It's just not as much fun as when John's not here to.
I mean, y'all have been here longer than I have. Has it been that? Has it been that way always?
Yeah.
John?
I've known him longer than all of you,
Yeah.
and it's my dad. Okay.
Okay. I just thought I'd ask, you know, some inside scoop there.
It follows him everywhere.
I like his work sense of humor, though. I have one.
I like such a dry sense of humor.
Yeah, yeah.
You just have to laugh to make him move on.
Oh, I think I said I got to stop laughing. I got in trouble a couple of times. They call Rachel a cow.
Yeah.
Right, and not just a cow. It's an ugly cow.
Yeah. I kind of felt bad about it for Leah, you know, but they said that he loved her last. Didn't love
Well, I
her.
think it was just to push the
One
point
of them
he was
were named
making.
after an animal. One was a lamb. Isn't that right? A lamb?
I can't remember.
I don't know, was Leah the cow or was Rachel the cow?
Rachel was the cow. The
Rachel
pretty
was-
one was the cow.
Okay.
But as John said, there's a whole bunch of other different names for it, and he just
Right.
picked the funniest one, I think.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Oh, you're right, you did, yeah, there were several meetings, but,
Yeah.
It's ewe. Rachel means lamb. So it is the other way.
yeah, that's what I thought, Leah.
That's what I was thinking, because no, I don't have Rachel on my team.
Because Rachel was the pretty
next time
one,
I see a
and,
Leah,
and that's why he was saying,
Yeah.
that's why Leah was
yeah, Rachel means
Rachel was the
lamb,
pretty one, yeah.
or ewe, meaning ewe, ugly.
Yeah. It kind of fits the theme more.
And
Yeah, okay, that's right, yeah.
Yeah,
Leah,
speaking of the devil.
Inform you, I got tagged in.
You got tagged.
John tagged me in.
Yeah.
That's his turn.
Explain it. I don't-
That's an inside joke.
okay,
But he was getting on to you and he tagged me in to carry on.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you know.
He said you would understand.
We'll fill
Well, I
it in,
did
John.
it. Oh, dear's your grandson.
They were just exchanging,
oh, I said to him,
yeah.
he said he fixed it that I would be able to move the slide. So I was clicking and I said, it won't work.
I know you weren't happy to
He said, no, you gotta fix it over here. I said, well,
No, it's really.
yeah, I've always had to do that.
But it looks really cute on
But he fixed it.
No, he didn't.
He fixed it where you could do it over there.
Oh,
If he hadn't have fixed it, you wouldn't have been able to do it over there.
There again. Here we
That's
go.
where it wasn't doing it.
She wouldn't let her mom brush her hair anymore because it was too long.
That's
Gotta
where it
love it.
wasn't.
Gotta
So
love it.
her mom said, fine, we're going to go get a cut. She had a first
We
one.
got to do the right fix.
At a salon.
It just,
Trying to get you
How
calves
you doing, Mike?
hooked
Hi,
up.
Maxine.
Hi there.
well, I'm still dealing with this plantar fasciitis. And it's supposed to stretch several times a day.
Sit right here.
Stretch.
That's your
spot.
Oh, I thought you were anxious.
We'll get you a 2x4
Yeah,
and
she
put
just
your toes
matches
on
it.
it. Okay.
That probably would work. Thanks so
You're
much.
welcome.
Do
Then when
some
you get to
pro this.
2x4 where it's just easy, get a 4x4.
And then when you get to where that's easy,
No, you just keep doing it on it.
oh,
That's high enough to make it simple.
Marcus gets in.
oh.
Are the calves stiffen up on you? Is that it?
No.
Just got to keep them from doing it, so you got to
Get her
stretch
new
them.
haircut.
Oh,
It's cute.
okay.
I like it long, but that is cute.
How cute.
Every once in a while, these.
It's way down the middle of her back, past the middle of her back.
Yeah,
She really
expand
wants-
this mouse about
Cut it.
4 times
That
the
is-
size, so you can find it.
Yeah.
Well, you can probably do that. You
Yeah.
can make that.
It's
up
on there
a
now,
little bit.
Dale. Oh, wait, it's still on there now. Click it. I can see the
When I take
mouth
you
to
out of school,
start.
they're always like, I
He
saw
probably
her
knows
when
how
she's
to
out
do
of
it, but
school.
I
Well,
don't.
I'd like to leave it there,
That's
because
why.
he hits record,
Uh-huh.
then that's when I gotta click it.
You know, he
Uh,
could probably
he
tell
moved
you how
it.
to make that there. You done got rid of it now.
Oh, so there it is.
Yeah, this is what
Leave it in blue, you can see it better.
was.
My computer, the DAV, I got the computer
Ah.
screen over here.
So
That's cute.
And that was her first
When you get there,
visit
just
to a
leave it alone
salon
a minute.
instead of her mom going home.
Well, I need to turn it around.
I Isaac,
Huh?
the computer screen at the DAB, I got a computer over here with a screen, I got a screen here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
But
I had a
it's set
feeling it
up
was
to
gonna
where
happen.
it don't come
This
this
is
way.
one of my
Oh.
It
favorite.
goes that way and comes over.
Now we
It's
reset.
confusing.
Hey, I made up my mind. I hate computers. I can't stand them.
Oh, well.
Hey, I'm off the grid. I don't even go on there unless I have to.
Now, was it her mother's idea or yours?
Well, all I can do with that was fill out the forms.
Yeah. That's all I do is I work strictly in my work, you know.
I hear you got your job back.
Huh?
I hear you got your job back.
Watch out here.
Great shot.
Well,
Watch out.
what I'm gonna do is hopefully in a year I'll be a
I've
manager.
seen her anymore.
You know, I got a
Is this
raise.
registered resident again?
I make a. Well, I'm still measly old.
Because
I make my salary is $23.10 now a month. That's for my salary. That's my gross.
No, that
But it is
puts
cute
you up
on
in
her.
furlough wage.
And I missed her hair.
Yeah, and then in a year and a half I'll go up. I'll get an $1,100 raise when
I
I.
haven't seen
Take
her
over the
since I was
warehouse,
young.
so-
How long I've been-
That don't give you much incentive to get raises whenever you have to get into a furlough wage.
Well, you don't get raises. The only way you get more money is promotion. You know, they don't give raises. They really don't.
She's not tender-headed. She just.
And the only reason I went up to 23.10 is they did a market throughout the state because I'm an offset press operator too. You know, and I don't even run that thing no more. You know, and I do everything else but that. You know. I do
Okay,
some
John,
buying.
hit record, will you please? Good man.
You lose your marker? Yep, there you go.
Oh, yeah, we in business.
I had it there, see?
You got recording on till the voice don't play.
Hello,
Hey,
Pat.
everybody, hi, Pat.
Oh, yeah, it's bouncing. Okay. The green light wasn't bouncing.
Ah,
I'm Miss Packer.
My nose.
Oh, I'm not good.
we're in Genesis chapter 30, and we're actually going to start at verse 27 tonight. We'll finish chapter 30, and then we'll get into 31, hopefully. We'll see how far it goes, but I think we'll get into 31. And on your handout is page 74. Capital letter J. Godly people can bless the lives of others. So,
Oh, I do.
hopefully everybody enjoyed the rain and nobody got flooded out or anything like that.
Do you need a cough syrup?
Uh,
Cough syrup?
Oh, no, I've got a creek in the bedroom window. Lights fixed.
hello, Kathy. You do?
Oh, yeah.
I did send an email message out to everybody today. Some of you don't get email though, so let me just tell you. We'll make the announcements later, but John's been doing some tests, and he has been diagnosed with leukemia. It's a treatable leukemia. He has to start chemotherapy Monday, and he'll have 7 straight days of chemotherapy. They told him he won't lose his hair, but he will be very fatigued and very weak. So keep John and Sharon in your prayers.
Right here.
And Jensen has finished his quarter of teaching, so he's back with us tonight. So Jensen, if you would like to lead us in a prayer tonight, I would certainly appreciate that.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all your many wonderful blessings. We thank you for this wonderful day you've given us to be able to gather here this evening to study another portion of your word. Please be with the teachers that they have, that they can teach the word in a manner that is easy for us to understand, that we can apply it in our lives and bring others to you. Please be with the Nip family as they go through this time, and hope. We pray that John will recover from leukemia, and the treatments that he has provided will resolve the issue, and that it would go into remission. Forgive us our sins to repent of them. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, Genesis 30th chapter, beginning at verse 27. This is actually beginning at 25, where Rachel had borne Joseph, and so Jacob said to Laban, he said, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you." And that takes us to verse 27 and 28. And Isaac, why don't we begin with you tonight?
Genesis 30.
Yes, verse 27, 28.
And Laban said to him, Please stay, if I found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, Name me your wages, and I will give it.
Okay, so, do what?
You need to change that.
Why? Oh, I do, don't I? Thank you. All right. So, godly people can bless the lives of others, as I have up there. Laban acknowledged God's blessing and extending on to him because of Jacob. I mean, he's gotten all this free labor and everything. So Laban is ready to go to almost any limit now to retain a man whose services have been so advantageous to him. Although the line between good business and selfish can be fine, Laban shows himself to be on the selfish side when this agreement begins to cost him. Look at Genesis 31 verse 7. I don't have that up there, but I'll read that real quick. Genesis 31 verse 7 says, Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. Now this, of course, is Jacob talking about the fact that Laban had deceived him 10 times. And yet Jacob is at this point asking to be let go to return to his family. Any comments on 27 or 28? All right, look at verses 29 and 30. Ron, you want to read that for me, please?
So Jacob said to him, You know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house?
Okay, now in your handout, this is actually capital letter K, and it concludes the chapter and everything. Verses 28 through 43, okay? But I'm going to look at a few other scriptures here that I think are important, or a couple of other verses. First off, when we look at this, Jacob had made Laban a wealthy man, and his work had not been acknowledged. And this was the concern that we have here. Obviously, Jacob takes advantage of the concession made by his father-in-law and asserts that it was for his sake that the Lord had blessed him. And that very well could be true. Now we look at Genesis 31 through 34. Stephanie, you want to read that, please?
So he said, What shall I give you? And Jacob said, You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of my wages comes before you, everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen, if it is with me. And Laban said, Oh, that were according to your word.
All right, so Jacob chose to refer his cause to God in the way here proposed, rather than to enter into an agreement for stated wages with Laban, whose selfishness was excessive. He would have no such cattle left under his care as were colored in any unusual way. And then he required that the spotted and the speckled, which they bred, should be given to him. Thus it would appear, whenever the question concerning his hire should be started, that he had acted honestly, provided none but those of the stipulated colors were found in his possession. And Laban, judging from observation then that his cattle would breed but few colors differently than themselves, eagerly accepted his proposal. Laban's idea here was, well, this means that Jacob won't get very much.
35, Jacob's loading the deck too.
Yeah, well, now let's read verses 35 and 36, John. That's a nice segue. Just go ahead and read that for me.
And he removed, well, you got to read 34. And Laban said,
Well, we did read 34.
I my wood.
Oh, okay.
It might be according to thy word. And he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-shanked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them unto the sons, the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks.
Okay,
So he done already went and moved them out before Jacob got a chance to.
he did. Laban obviously showed distrust in Jacob by these 3 things. First thing he did is he separated Jacob's flocks. Although the agreement stipulated that Jacob would do this. Secondly, he put his sons in charge of Jacob's flock. And thirdly, he separated his flock from Jacob's by a 3-day journey. So those who are least trustworthy always doubt the veracity of others. Yes, John?
I read this that he didn't give them to Jacob. He separated them so Jacob wouldn't find them.
That was
So
the
they wasn't
idea.
Jacob's flock, he kept them.
Kept
That's
them.
why he put 3 days between them so Jacob wouldn't find them.
Right. But Jacob did have some flock.
Jacob already had a few of his own.
Right. And that's what he did. He separated these from Jacob's flock. 3 days. So he wouldn't find them. You're right. And so the idea then is those who are least trustworthy always doubt the veracity of others. Although Laban does all of these things to limit Jacob's acquisitions, it will ultimately work for Jacob's advantage, because it will allow Jacob to carry out his crossbreeding in relative privacy without Laban or his shepherd spying or checking on him. Okay, any comments through verse 36? All right, look at verses 37 through 39. Pat, you want to read that for me, please?
Now Jacob took him for himself rods of green poplar and of almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks and in the gutters in the water troughs, where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaks, speckled and spotted. One more?
No, this is good here. Now here's the interesting thing about this story that we just read here in verses 37 through 39. It's believed in many cultures that, particularly in sheep, whatever fixes their attention to copulation is marked upon the young. That's part of the reason why you see these sticks in there. So in a sense, this practice may be compared to casting lots. All right. Many ancients believed that casting lots was divinely controlled, although most would argue that its outcome was random chance. On some occasions, however, it is obvious that God controlled those circumstances. And I've got a couple of examples up here. Let's look at Joshua, the 7th chapter, verses 14 through 18. And this is dealing with Achan. Joshua 7:14 through 18. Kathy?
In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought according to your tribes. And it shall be that the tribe which the Lord takes shall come according to families, and the family which the Lord takes shall come by households, and the household which the Lord takes shall come man by man. Then it shall be that he who is taken with the accursed thing shall be burned with fire, he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, and because he has done a disgraceful thing in Israel. So Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel by their tribes, and the tribe of Judah was taken. He brought the clan of Judah, and he took the family of the Zarhites, and he brought the family of the Zarhites man by man, and Zabdi was taken. Then he brought his household man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah was taken.
So, this is one situation where God controlled the circumstances. Another one we find in Jonah, Jonah, the first chapter, verse 7. Maxine, you had that one?
And they said, every one to his fellow, come and let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause is evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah.
Okay, another one that we're very familiar with is Matthias in Acts, the first chapter, verse 26. Florence?
John answered them, saying, I baptize with water, but there stands one among you whom you do not know.
Did you read Matthew?
I read
Or Acts 1:26?
Acts 1:26?
Yes. I don't know which one you read, but...
I'm in John, I'm sorry.
That was good.
I was going, what version of the Bible is that?
Acts 1:26.
I know that wasn't going to take care of Matthias.
She's worried about me.
Okay, and they cast their lots, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles.
All right, so here's three examples where God controlled the circumstances. And that's the case that what we see here. Jacob can do all of this as far as the rods and everything, but it was God who controlled the circumstances here in this situation. Ultimately, Jacob testifies that indeed it was God, not the sticks, that brought the desired results. Look at Genesis, the 31st chapter, and I don't have that up there. But Donna, if you had that, Genesis 31, verses 9 through 12, if you will, please.
Thus God had taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. And it came about at the time when the flock were mating that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. He said, Lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you.
Okay, so Jacob acknowledges that it was indeed God who controlled the circumstances here. Any comments through verse 39?
I have a comment.
Yes.
Okay, what are the rods? And okay, the intention was this to make his flock conceive? Is that what all
Yes.
that was about? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
The idea was that when they come up to the rod...
and what is a rod? I'm call me
Isn't that another stick thing?
You go back to verse 37, says, Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods.
Okay, so it'd be like wood.
Yeah,
trees.
he just took the branches of the wood, took the bark off the wood and everything.
Okay.
Today, you don't see it much anymore, but there are still a lot of farmers today that believe in being able to divine for water to dig a well.
Mm-hmm.
My father-in-law was one. He would take the willow, a forked willow branch, and oftentimes he'd peel part of the bark off and everything, and he'd walk along, and when that willow branch dipped and everything, there was water there.
Copper wire.
Copper wire did it too.
Copper wire, some people use that, but the one I'm most familiar with is they'd use generally willow or some type of wood. And I'm convinced that the only reason the wood dipped, or the copper wire, is because their wrists got tired.
I've seen the copper wire bend.
You've seen it bend?
I've seen it bend. They
Or they
dug
stumbled.
down and they didn't find water there because they stopped digging 4 foot too soon. Because just a little ways over, they dug a cellar back in the side of the hill, and they hit an artesian well in the corner.
So,
So the water was there, they just didn't dig deep enough.
how hot was the weather that made that copper well?
It was in the fall. It was in the cool weather.
Oh. All right. Enough fun with that. All right, let's look at verses 41 through 43.
I don't know if his thumb was on it bending it or not.
That could have been. You never know. Jensen, you want to read verses 41 through 43 for me, please?
And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys.
Okay, so as you see there, in order to increase the strength of the flock, as well as the number, Jacob would only lay the sticks in the troughs when the stronger sheep were breeding. When the weaker ones bred, Jacob would not lay the sticks in the troughs, so the feebler would be Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. But again, like I say, you go to Genesis 31 verses 9 through 12, Jacob admitted that God is the one that controlled the circumstances here.
So how did he get the servants and the camels and
That was just an extra.
What box did he use?
Do what, John?
how did he get the servants and the camels and the asses? The donkeys.
In verse 43, you mean?
Yeah.
Had a large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. I don't know how he got them.
Those are
Well,
extra.
his wages
Yeah.
had to be, because he's not going to steal them.
Either that or he traded sheep for them.
Well, he had to get around
Well,
somehow. You know.
Well, you got to keep in mind now, when Jacob traveled to Haran, he didn't travel just by himself. He had animals that went with him. And the whole time he was here, I'm assuming that these animals did in fact breed and they did produce an increase in numbers. And servants, I don't know how many servants he took with him, but he probably had some servants with him to take care of the livestock, because as we talked, what was it, last week or the week before, this was not a couple of days journey. This was over several months, maybe 6 months or more. And so they had to have livestock for food. They had to have servants to take care of those livestock. They had to make sure that the livestock got pasture. All of this had to take place. Nothing is ever said in the scriptures how many he took with him. All we know is what it says here is that when he left, he had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Again, we don't know how many camels, we don't know how many donkeys. But we do know that the camels were used to transport his new wives and children back to his homeland. Yes, John?
We know that he had flocks when he got there, because
Yes.
it says that if something happened to one of the lambs that got tore up, he didn't put the loss to Laman, he made up the loss. So
That's
he
true.
had to have the flocks to be able to make up the loss.
Very true.
And that's before the speckles and the spotted ones.
Where that bargain came up.
So the point is, the Lord fulfills Jacob's promise, or his promise, God's promise, and blesses the one whom he had promised to bless in this situation. So now that takes us to chapter 31, unless somebody has some other questions or comments about chapter 30. Yes, Donna.
Why were the sheep so important to have? When they used them as livestock, did they ate them, or they used the wool or stuff?
Wool for clothing, and yes, the
So
meat.
the spotted ones weren't as desirable to have because the wool wouldn't be usable, I guess?
Wool was usable, but the other thing too, remember the Levitical law.
Oh, that's right. They had to prove it to be able to use them as sacrifice.
Yeah, they had to be able to use them for sacrifice, but also for food. What was the criteria for food in the Levitical law? An animal had to what? Had to have cloven hooves and
Spotless.
had to chew a cud.
Here, yeah.
Okay? A rabbit chews a cud, but a rabbit is an unclean animal. Why?
Don't have food.
No cloven hooves. A hog has cloven hooves, but it's unclean because it does not chew a cud. Okay? So the sheep were very important for a food source and for clothing source. That's a good question.
Also for trading
For
other things.
Yeah, trading or bartering, yes, absolutely. Any other questions or comments?
If I remember right, didn't he come there in the first place to get a wife?
Yes,
Okay, well, he brought, you always bring gifts.
right.
So he kind of had herds, lots of good stuff.
Yeah, he had to have something for a dowry, you know. But
Yeah,
he not only left there with a wife, he left there with 2 wives and some concubines, and
He came with 7 years of labor.
that's true.
That was a dowry.
Well, that was true. Yeah, actually, more than 7 years.
7 years for each one.
Right.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
it wasn't 7 years for each one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, he did work.
one after the other.
But
too.
yeah, I know, but then he didn't have to work 7 years.
He didn't have to wait 7 years, but he
But he still had to wait. Oh,
yeah
okay.
he did
Yeah,
work
he
7
had to
years.
work 7 years for that.
But he got
married.
Rachel a week after
Yeah.
Leah's week, as the scriptures say. Okay. All right. Let's look at chapter 31.
He'd have been better off if he did take Leah and ran.
I'm a firm believer that the Mormons were crazy to think that they could have multiple wives, because one is enough.
He's smiling.
Easy, Dale. Easy. Easy.
Works both ways.
You're gonna
Yeah,
start
but you don't see the Mormon women having multiple husbands. They already knew that one was enough.
Well, they got multiple wives. So wives can help against the husband.
Oh,
They don't want more husbands. They only want one, but they want to share where they only get a quarter and a quarter and a quarter.
that's right. That's what I say. The women already knew that one husband was enough. The men weren't smart enough to know that. All right, so let's look at chapter 31. In your handout, this is page 75, and the title that Victor Eskew gives it is Jacob Flees, misspelling there, flees from Laban. And the key verse he uses, or verses, is Genesis 31, verses 20 and 21. And so we'll look at the lessons then. So the idea is that, let's look at verses 1 through 3, first off. Isaac, we're back to you.
Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what our fathers he had acquired all this wealth. And Jacob saw the content of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you.
All right, so obviously over the course of time, our relationships with people can change. And this is what we're seeing here. Verses 1 through 3 explains the motivation for Jacob's sudden departure. First, Laban's sons had developed animosity towards Jacob due to his acquiring Laban's wealth. And second, Jacob could see that Laban no longer regarded him with favor. So finally, the Lord directed Jacob to leave, is what we see there in verse 3. Now looking at verse 4 and 5.
Dale,
Yes.
in that chapter, that verse 1, did you read that, Isaac, did you read Jacob, he heard the words?
Yeah.
Yeah, saying Jacob has taken away all that was our father's.
Was talking to God.
Do what?
I always thought that meant that was God was hurting.
Well, no, it says, now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons.
Yeah. See, mine don't say that. He says he.
Jacob is added by the translators.
Yeah. Yeah, Jacob is in parentheses here.
Yeah.
So yours says, now he heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a continuation from chapter 30. Okay? Because remember in chapter 30, the last part there says, thus the man became exceedingly prosperous. Well, let's see. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Now he heard the words of Laban. Okay, so you kind of continue on from chapter 30 here. And so, yeah, it's Jacob. But Ron is correct. In the New King James Version, Jacob is in parentheses, or italics rather, showing that it was added by the... Yeah.
Well, if you read 1 and 2 together and continue, it tells you Jacob was the subject of he.
Right, because verse 2 says, and Jacob saw the countenance of Laban. Okay, so that's a continuation which would reinforce what John's saying, that it is Jacob here.
No, it says in Jacob that beheld.
Yeah. All right, so good question. So Jacob could see, as I mentioned, that he no longer was favored or regarded with favor by Laban. And so finally in verse 3, the Lord directed him to leave. So now let's look at verses 4 and 5. Ron?
So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to the flock, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me.
Okay, so that he calls Rachel and Leah to the field, or into the field, is the first indication that he plans to leave surreptitiously. Jacob later explains this as being motivated by fear. Look at verse 31, if you will, of chapter 31, where he says, Then Jacob answered and said to Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. And so his indication was to get out of there as quick as possible. This fear was not necessary, though, as shearing was done at the end of the herding cycle. Look at verse 19, for example. It says, Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. Okay, so this was the end of the shearing, or the shearing cycle. It was the end of the herding cycle, the end of the contract period. And secondly, Jacob did not need to fear, as his departure was sanctioned by God. Going back to verse 3. Okay? So Jacob explains to Rachel and Leah why they are leaving. This is most likely an effort to ensure that their loyalty to him is more so over to him more so than it is to their father. Verses 14 and 15, for example, suggest that this loyalty would not be difficult to obtain. Look at verses 14 and 15, and here we read, Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. Remember, this is where John got caught up in what the two names mean.
I didn't get caught up in it. You just said it means something it didn't mean.
Well, it does mean cow.
Hired cow.
They were two women who their father had used in a bartering situation for his advantage. And this is what they're saying here in verses 14 and 15. So Jacob's speech begins and continues and ends with God's victory over Laban. First off, in verse 5, Laban is against him when it says, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before, but that the God of my father has been with me. And then Laban cheated him, but God did not allow harm. Look at verses 6 and 7. And you know that with all my might I have served your father, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. And then finally, Laban changes the wages, but God changed the flocks. Look at verses 8 and 9. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streak shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streak. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. You see where God is involved in this? Any comments through verse 5? Yes, Isaac.
I just don't see where he saw the favorable at all.
Where who was favorable?
Well, I don't see where Jacob saw the... To me, it didn't look like Laban was ever favorable to Jacob. It was like he was always taken from him or being,
He was cordial to him.
Yeah. I'm just saying, I just don't... It's amazing that he could say that, because from all I can tell so far, he's just been rotten to him the whole time, and deceiving him and lying to him. So I just thought that just kind of... Well, it's good of him, I guess, because he's still being good. So.
Well, and you're right. A couple of things to always keep in mind is just as we read there in verses 14 and 15 what the two women said about their father.
Yeah.
Their father looked at the two women as basically servants.
Right.
They were, and I don't mean this derogatory, but my mother-in-law and father-in-law had 10 children. Those children worked very hard in the cotton fields. In fact, they picked cotton by hand. Today you have machines and everything. But if they didn't go out there and pick that cotton at a specific time, it didn't get done. It didn't get to market. And so the mother and father took advantage of having 10 children to take and harvest the cotton. Laban here took a big advantage of his 2 daughters here to use them as servants to water the flocks. Remember, this is where Jacob first saw Rachel, was there at the watering hole. And so they were basically servants to Laban. So what Laban saw was, okay, you're going to take my daughter, you're going to take, and in his mind, you're going to take both my daughters. You don't know this yet, but you're going to take both my daughters. And if you're going to take my daughters, that means I'm going to be without some help here. So I'm going to take advantage of this. I'm going to get some help from you. And so we're going to come up with this agreement that you're going to work for me for X number of years. And that's going to help me out. And so everything that Laban did was in a selfish standpoint. Right. It was for his benefit, right, and not for God's benefit, right, not for Rachel or not for Leah, and certainly not for Jacob. Right. Right. Even though Jacob was a relative of his. Right. Anybody have any thoughts? Yes, Pat.
You have to keep in mind that he was also an idolater. What do you expect? He's just looking out for material things. Yeah. Not anything spiritual or honesty and all that. He's trying to gain.
That's very true.
Yeah, that whole first 7 years, he always planned to give Leah to him because he wanted another 7 years.
Yeah.
And it all backfired because in the end, with that agreement, he lost everything. Everything he gained, then he lost at the end because God gave it all to
Jacob. Yeah.
But what's that part of their culture that, I mean, his daughters were his servants, basically. I mean, they were his property.
Yeah.
Still have that idea over in that part of the country.
That's true.
Yeah. That's very true.
Mean, he could pretty much do what he wanted to because they were his property.
Yeah. That's the way they look at it. And like John says, you still see that to a great extent in the Middle East and in that country. So.
It also goes back to when Rachel sent Joseph on this trip to find his wife, that she said this was in God's favor.
Yes.
So God was with him all the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments? Good discussion here. All right, let's look at verses 6 through 9. And
you already read those.
Oh, we did?
You did. You read through 10.
But we can read them again, though.
I did. I read, actually, I read through verse 9, didn't I? Yeah. All right, so let me put 6 through 9 up here. There we go. God will often protect his faithful from the evildoers. What I was looking at is from a different standpoint, but what I want to look at now is when you look at verses 6 through 9 here, the contract stipulated that Jacob was to receive all of the unusually colored of the flock. Look at verses 31 through 34. Let's see. Stephanie, is it your turn to read?
31 through 34.
Yes. Of chapter 31, yes.
And Jacob answered...
I'm sorry. Chapter 30.
I read that last time. I'll read it again.
Oh, you're going to read it again.
Sure. Let me get back to it.
Because it makes a point here.
31...
No, 31, 31 through 34, chapter 30.
Okay. And he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything, if thou wilt do this thing for me. I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through all of thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to the word.
All right. You did a much better job reading the second time.
I switched over to a different version. I was looking up some of them.
All right, go back to chapter 31 now and look at verse 8.
Question.
Yes.
If Jacob has kept his sheep for 14 years, you'd think he knew every spotted and speckled and stuff, so when he went up there to pick out them, he'd know that somebody had already taken them all out.
You'd think so. But now remember, they're still breeding too.
Yeah, but I'm saying, though, he knows which sheep are already that way.
Yes.
And they're gone.
Yeah. Look at verse 8 of chapter 31. It says, if he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So, however Laban did this, however he sought to distinguish among the unusual sheep, it didn't work. 10 times, as the history of these 6 years between Genesis 30 and 31 is very compendious, we cannot determine whether Laban changed Jacob's wages exactly 10 times, even though we saw that in the verse, or whether the expression only meant in general many times. It is plain, however, that Laban tried all methods of circumventing and defrauding him, but obviously it was in vain. Jacob attributes his herd to God rather than to his devices. He is making clear to his wives that he did not dupe Laban out of his flocks by magic or trickery. And so, as the verse says, so God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me, is what he's saying to Leah and Rachel, okay? Enough time had passed for much of Laban's original flock to be replaced, and Jacob's flock to have grown to the point that it seemed that he had taken the entire flock of Laban. At least it certainly appeared that way to Laban's sons. That goes back to verse 1 when it says, now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth.
I need to go 3 days over and find the ones that Daddy took away from me.
So he still has those that are 3 days away, correct, or no?
Yeah, he had them.
Right, okay.
He kept them separated for 3 days. So
He kept them separated, trying to deceive Jacob, obviously.
But the original agreement was Jacob got all the speckled, all the striped, all the spotted. So didn't make no difference what there was, he got them.
That's exactly right.
And he's changed it to where they didn't get any of them, you know.
God,
Get it to where he didn't get any.
God intervened and circumvented Laban's goals here, if you would. Any comments through verse 9? All right, John, I think it's your turn. If you'd read verses 10 through 13 for me of chapter 31.
And it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived that they lifted up thine eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-shanked, speckled, and grizzly. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here am I. And he said, Lift up now thine eyes and see. All the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-shanked, speckled, and grizzly. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee, and I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred.
Okay. Now, for those that are still using your handout, it's page 76, and we're at capital letter F in your handout, okay? So, the angel of God refers to himself as the God of Bethel here. And we'll not take time to look at these verses here, but this goes back to Genesis 28, verse 15, and verses 20 through 22, okay? So finally, Jacob tells his wives that they are to leave because God commanded it. And God's reference back to Bethel then would remind Jacob of the dream there that he had and the promises that was made to him. Essentially, what is happening here, God is telling Jacob that he had fulfilled his word, and now it was time for Jacob to fulfill his. Any comments through verse 13? All right, let's look at verses 14 through 16. Pat, you want to read that for me, please?
Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our Father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our Father are already ours, and our children now then, whatever God has said to you, do it.
All right, so what we see here is the actions of one in the home can negatively impact the other family members. For example, Laban's actions impacted the inheritance of his daughters. And that's why you see that question there. Is there any portion at all or inheritance for us in our father's house? Laban's daughters are agreeing that their father has indeed cheated Jacob of his due and thereby has cheated them as well. Yes, John?
Daughters didn't have inheritance.
That's true. But they're asking, is there anything at all, any portion at all in the house? The firstborn got 2/3, you're right.
Unless it was a girl.
The boys.
Firstborn male.
Right, that's what I mean. The firstborn male, thank you.
The girls didn't get anything.
You're right. You're right. But they're asking because the promise was made to Jacob. So they're asking, okay, Laban's daughters are agreeing that their father has indeed cheated Jacob, okay, of his due, and thereby cheating Jacob, they cheated, or their father cheated them as well. So note that the focus of the response is not on agreement to God's decree, but on the material possessions, or lack thereof, that they would receive from their father. It almost makes you wonder what the response would have had, or would have been, had the wealth lay in Laban's hands. Nothing more is said about Leah in regard to this, but shortly we see more evidence of where Rachel's intentions lay regarding material things. And we'll see that next week. Their speech makes a further point, though. Calling to attention their children evidences the women's zeal for their own heirs, distinguishing their family from that of their father and also from their brothers. Okay? But I mentioned that next week we'll see that Rachel, she steals her father's idols. So you see the material aspect here. And we'll look at that next week.
She's going to get hers.
She's going to get hers.